Hi, I'm Mark Walker. I'm the editorial director of the FinTech Times, and we're here at 24Fintech. I'm going to ask my interviewee to introduce herself to the camera, but I don't think you really need any introduction. Please.
It's good to be back. I'm Leda Glyptis. I'm author of Bankers Like Us, and I'm an advisor to a number of companies of all sizes. I work with some big banks. I work with some fintechs of all sizes. And I'm really loving being here today.
Fantastic. So that's what we want to talk about. Obviously, normally when we have our conversations, we're sitting somewhere in London or Amsterdam or maybe even Vegas occasionally. But now we're here in the Middle East. So give me a bit of an overview of what's your thoughts about the Middle East as a fintech ecosystem?
Well, as you know, and we were talking about before we started rolling, I lived in the region a few years back. I was the chief innovation officer of QNB, in fact, the biggest bank in Middle East and Africa. And it has been very interesting for me to observe how the region has started really actively leaning into this space. And the reality is we have seen the sort of European market start from equating fintech with startups and then equating fintech with new technologies. And in the last few years, realizing that actually it's all about the safe adoption at scale of new technologies in a regulated, controlled environment for meaningful material execution. I don't care what you do in your innovation center. I care what you go live with to your customers at scale. And one of the things I find really interesting about the region is actually they started there. A lot of the leaning into this space has been spearheaded by the regulators, particularly SAMA, where we are now. And the reality is the minute you create a framework of both what is acceptable and how to execute it, leaning in for all the participants, traditional and fintech entities, is much, much easier. So they're leapfrogging, and it's very interesting to see.
Yeah, and I think that's the interest. Obviously, as you know, we commission our own Middle East and Africa report each year. And so we've obviously seen over the last 3 years especially an absolute ginormous acceleration, predominantly, as you say, given by the regulators, etc. What within the region, where do you think each of the various different players are when it comes to their sort of adoption of fintech?
If we had had this conversation when I was living in the region, the answer would have been hands down the UAE. And in fact, the UAE context being what it is, it was ADGM that was spearheading and really bringing new ideas in the space. They did things like, do you remember they created a framework for ICOs at the time, which was a bit mind-blowing for the rest of us, going, what are you doing? And then, if I'm not mistaken, it was the Omani regulators that came in first with messaging standards for API connectivity in region. But I think in the last few years, it is undeniably hands down SAMA that's leading the charge, particularly around open banking, creating a real vision of what a connected, globally competitive financial ecosystem could look like. And I particularly love two things about it. One is that they're not thinking about the interplay of traditional players and fintechs. They're thinking about adoption of technology for the good of the consumer. Whether you're a big player or a small player, it doesn't matter. And that is absolutely the right way of thinking about it. The second, and I'll be talking about it in my keynote tomorrow, is that they're focusing on the building blocks of a digital economy. They're not necessarily following the hype cycles. They're not necessarily going really into the weeds of particular technologies. They're saying, well, we can see the direction of travel over the last 20 years. So the things we need to think about is secure connectivity, scalability, messaging standards. That doesn't sound exciting, but actually it is the bedrock of how you create a connected and open ecosystem. So I would say we sit in the leading hub of transformation in the region.
And I think, obviously, open banking you picked up on there, that's really interesting. Obviously, there's comparisons between other places that have implemented open banking, such as the UK, Australia, but Saudi really seem to have gone about it in a different way, more focused on use cases, would you say, and less on the actual technology side of it?
Yeah, I would say that, and I don't know whether it is because they have been observing what is happening, as you say, in the UK and Australia, where the regulation has been around for quite a long time, and not much has happened. a lot of money and time and energy has been spent becoming compliant, but the creativity around use cases hasn't really been there. It has been heralded as something that is really good for the consumer, but the consumer is not going to spearhead adoption. And we just haven't seen that many use cases. And we're seeing actually some retraction. Australia published some really dispiriting statistics about how many of the connections are actually in use. So focusing on the use case is absolutely the right thing, because if we're putting all that money and effort and time into building a connected ecosystem, what is it for is actually the most important thing to drive usage.
And I think that's possibly why being here in the kingdom is seen to be the more leading one, because of the population size. They do need the use cases. Some of the smaller GCC countries perhaps don't have the same requirements, would you say, or don't have the same type of consumer?
I think that's a fair observation. It's definitely a bigger society and much more diverse in terms of its financial stratification, in terms of the types of economic activity that fuel the economy. Although there is a large expat community here, they don't represent as big a chunk of the economy as they would where I lived in Qatar. So it is definitely a richer tapestry of communities with different financial needs. And of course, that always inspires greater creativity and innovation when you have more user groups. Because of course, when it comes to creative applications of technology, you usually go to the segments that are underserved. And the larger and more diverse the economic activity around you, the more likely you are to find those opportunities.
Yeah. And then again, maybe thinking about sort of the wider sort of region, in the same way that, you know, some companies look at Europe as a single market, people look here at the Middle East as a single market. And that's just not the right way of doing it, is it?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, I have often heard people talk about the wider Arab-speaking world as a single market, and that couldn't be further from the truth. I think it's fair to say that the GCC has obviously a cooperation mechanism, not just a history and pedigree of cooperation, but the GCC in itself is a council for cooperation. But that doesn't mean that the policies are always aligned. We know that there were times where there was disharmony in their midst. Actually, it was when I was living in the region, and although it was resolved, this is not a coherent bloc. There are absolute similarities. Particularly around some of the sort of economic activity that we were talking about earlier. But the nature of the societies, the priorities of the government are actually very, very different. And for anyone who lives in the region, even visiting, you feel that you are actually in very, very different communities. The reality is that there will always be collaboration in the region. There will always be connectivity in the region. And as we move to a wider connected world, chances are they will be spearheaded in region first and then opened up more widely. But demographics alone means that the needs and priorities of each of those societies will not be fully aligned. And although I anticipate that dialogue will continue, yes, they're not interchangeable. And it would be good to remember that when we're having these conversations in Europe.
I think so, but I think also people underestimate even Europe. You know, Europe is not one certain place. You hear a lot of companies, maybe from across the pond somewhere, going, "Oh yeah, I'm going to expand into Europe."
Yeah,
and
yeah.
They have no idea of the differences. So it's not unusual.
No, it's not. In fact, I was speaking to an American company, I won't name them, who were looking to expand into Europe, and they said, "Well, we've cracked the regulatory complexity of the federal and state level. How hard can Europe be?" And it's like, independent states federated at a supranational level, speaking different languages and implementing regulations differently. I'll tell you what, you tell me how difficult it can be once you've been here for a year or two.
Awesome. I don't want to take up too much of time. I could literally speak to you for hours, so we're not going to do that. But obviously this is the inaugural event, the first one of its kind. What have you thought about the event from when you first walked in this morning?
It's huge. It is huge. And it's interesting to be at an event that is essentially a marriage between a content conference with parallel streams running at the same time and a trade show, which we actually have started seeing less of in Europe. Coming back post-COVID, the trade show piece seems to have disappeared from most of the events I've attended in North America and Europe. And here it's back with a vengeance. And of course, when you have the trade show component and the multiple screen stages happening at the same time, you get that sense of high production values, because there are some really impressive stands around, and there's sort of activity and buzz. It's nice to see. It's really nice to see.
Yeah. A lot more walking, I've found.
A lot of walking, but having had some disastrous shoe choices in my first Cybosses a few years back, I know to pack comfortable shoes these days.
That's it. So my final question, the difficult one. When we sit here next year at this same event, what do you think we're going to be talking about?
I hope we'll be talking about my new book, which is out in January. See what I did there? So I'm hoping you'll let me plug that when we're here next year. I also think and hope and trust that, given the pace with which things are moving in the region, we will be talking about the successful implementation of certain things and the traction we're seeing. There are already presentations happening all around us about how the region is picking up its ranking in terms of quite a few indices around digital payments and activity that is fully digital, compared to markets that are really pioneering in the space like India. So it'll be really interesting to see how that progress continues tracking. So my book and the continued progress once the regulator has set the tone, seeing the players actually build.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me on the FinTech Times.
Thank you for having me.